Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 11 of The Devil's Brood, the Magna Carta. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, John had found himself in a conflict with the church over the Archbishop of Canterbury, which resulted in Pope Innocent III first placing the entire Kingdom of England under interdict, and then excommunicating John. Confined to England, John strengthened his control over Wales and Ireland to gain the revenue required to convince Otto, Holy Roman Emperor, and the Counts of Boulogne and Flanders to join his coalition against Philip, King of France. Rumors that Philip planned to invade England drove John to make peace with the church. Fortunately, Philip's fleet was caught in harbor and destroyed by an English fleet on May 30th, enabling John to safely sail across the Channel. The plan was for John to lead his army to retake Aquitaine and Anjou while the coalition kept Philip busy. However, the campaign did not go according to plan. Faced with Philip's son Louis leading an actual army, John fled, abandoning his men and equipment. Worse, a bloody battle between the coalition and Philip at Bouvines ended with the complete defeat of the coalition and the capture of the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne, leaving France the dominant power in Europe. Following the catastrophic defeat at Bouvines, it would have been wise for John to move carefully when dealing with his barons, but if John had known how to move carefully, he would not have been in this mess in the first place. After limping home with his tail between his legs, John met with his barons, who made it clear that they wanted to see changes in his management style. To be specific, they pressed John to agree to follow the Charter of Liberties issued by his great-grandfather Henry I when he became king in 1100. The leaders of the revolt, Eustace de Vichy and Robert Fitzwalter, were not good men concerned about the greater good of England. They were hard men, accustomed to near-total independence, who resented John's growing tyranny because it interfered in their own dominance of their lands. The rebellious barons have often been described as northerners because de Vichy was a northern baron, but the rebellion had supporters across the kingdom. Representing the king, William Marshal met with the barons in late April and was presented with a charter called the Unknown Charter because no one knows who drafted it. The charter showed that the barons were especially worried about 4 areas: justice, inheritance, military service, and the expansion of the royal forest. The barons wanted to limit military service to Normandy and Brittany, as well as limit the amount of scutage that barons would pay to avoid military service. Scutage was a sore point for the barons because John's father and brother had levied scutage 11 times in 45 years, while John had done it 11 times in 16 years. The mixture of practical complaints and sweeping changes to the moral foundations of Angevin rule reflects the difference between the barons who simply wanted better treatment for themselves and those who wanted to reform a system of government, but the end result attracted much more support. I need to point out that England had changed dramatically, which is why people may have accepted the idea of a piece of sheepskin binding a king. The population had grown to between 3.5 and 5 million by 1215, so people had begun to live in villages to work together to farm more efficiently. In addition, technological advances enabled England to move gradually from subsistence to an export economy during John's reign. Horses were replacing oxen and windmills had been invented in the 12th century, so farmers did not have to waste long hours grinding grain by hand. Eager for new sources of tax revenue, lords founded numerous towns, recognizing that plots of urban land could produce far more rent than his farmland. 57 new towns were founded in England between 1180 and 1230, which fostered the creation of a tiny, yet growing, urban class. At the same time, a better understanding of physics enabled architects to build castles and cathedrals with huge open spaces filled with light, rather than the smaller, one-story wooden buildings with gloomy interiors. Castles and great houses began to be built in stone and were several stories high. Stone walls permitted fireplaces with chimneys, piped water, latrines, and private rooms. These advances may seem insignificant today, but likely inspired awe at the time. Both the barons and the king had sent emissaries to Rome to lobby Innocent, but John's promise to permit free elections for church officials and a pledge to go on crusade convinced the Pope to support the king. Refusing to back down, a number of barons formally renounced their fealty on May 5th, 1215, so England found itself in a civil war. The conflict started well for the barons, since the citizens of London quickly opened the gates of the city. This support seems odd, since it is unlikely that the craftsmen and merchants of London had any sympathy for the tribulations of an extended family of extremely wealthy rural landowners with violent tendencies. Nope. The leading citizens saw an opportunity to continue their profitable tradition of forcing Angevin kings to give them privileges in exchange for support during moments of crisis. Stephen had given the city its freedom to win its support against Matilda during the anarchy, while the city had won the right to elect its own mayor because Richard had needed money for his crusade. Possession of London was decisive, so John agreed to a truce 10 days later. After a month of argument, the barons and the king agreed on what became known as the Articles of the Barons, which listed 49 specific points. The king and the barons met at Runnymede on June 19th, where the king swore to uphold the Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter, and the barons renewed their allegiance to John, although John undoubtedly hated the terms. He chose peace and attached his seal to the charter, which was then copied many times and distributed to the counties and towns of England later that month. Actually, John merely proclaimed publicly that he had accepted the clauses of the charter, and one of his officials was responsible for the menial labor of attaching the royal seal to each copy. The opening paragraph stated that the king confirmed the freedom of the English church. This statement does not appear in the Articles of the Barons, but Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of the main mediators between the king and the barons, so it seems likely that Langton inserted it on his own initiative. To be clear, the Magna Carta was not a Bill of Rights, but a peace treaty, where the baronial families imposed a set of conditions to prevent further abuses by the Angevin Dynasty. All foreign mercenaries were banished from England, and John could not levy scutage without the common council of the kingdom. The king could no longer charge huge fees for barons to inherit, or for widows to refuse to remarry. However, since the barons claimed to have rebelled to defend justice for the entire kingdom, not just themselves, they included clauses that benefited Wales and Scotland, London, the merchant class, and even peasants. Welsh and Scottish hostages were released, and all of the land that had been declared forest during John's reign was disafforested. The price of becoming a knight was set at £5 to gain their support. London not only received a guarantee of its liberties, but the London standard measure for the key staples of corn, cloth, and ale would be standard throughout the kingdom. Some clauses were simply practical. Instead of having to track John down to obtain justice, the Court of Common Pleas would have a fixed location, while county courts would be held at fixed places and at fixed times. While these various matters were undoubtedly important at the time, the broader clauses are why the charter became famous, especially Clause 39. No free man is to be arrested or imprisoned or deceased or outlawed or exiled or in any other way ruined, nor will we go or send against him except by the legal judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. The simple act of replacing no baron with no free man transformed it from a document about barons into a charter of freedom. Finally, a clause stated that if the king failed to follow the charter, a panel of 25 barons would be authorized to distress the king by taking his castle and lands, which was the first legal provision for a check on the king's powers other than the traditional methods of rebellion or support for another claimant to the throne. The complex document had two main ideas. The barons could act together as a community rather than as individuals, while the king was no longer above the law. In the end, the Magna Carta was supposed to be a peace treaty, but it failed because the king did not want a peace treaty. In late July, an angry John tried to force his barons to provide a charter pledging to defend him and his heirs. Their refusal ended the brief hope of peace, although the death blow came on August 24 when Pope Innocent issued a threat of excommunication if the king observed the Great Charter and if the barons attempted to force the king to observe the charter. By early September, the barons knew that war was unavoidable, but they needed someone with a claim to the throne in order to have an excuse to revolt. Therefore, they invited Prince Louis of France to claim the throne of England, since no English claimants still lived. Henry the Younger had died childless, as had Richard. Geoffrey's wife had given birth to Arthur after he died, but Arthur had disappeared, likely murdered by John. That left the child of one of Eleanor's 3 daughters with Henry, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan. Matilda's son Otto had become Holy Roman Emperor, but was busy losing a civil war for control of Germany. Eleanor had become Queen of Castile, and her son Henry, heir to the throne of Castile, but he was also 10. Joan had married Count Raymond of Toulouse, and their son Raymond was 18, but Toulouse was in the middle of a land grab under the cover of the Cathar Crusade, which left Louis, who had married Blanche, daughter of the Queen of Castile. Admittedly, Louis's claim was very weak, but he had another advantage, namely, the army needed to defeat John's mercenaries. Moreover, he would probably be an absentee overlord, giving the barons the freedom they craved. While this seemed to be a perfect opportunity for Philip, he was actually reluctant. If Louis should fail, the French crown would appear weak. Furthermore, a victorious Louis would suddenly become Philip's equal. Still, the offer could not be dismissed, so the Assembly of Melun was held in late April 1216, and Philip remained impartial as Louis and his advisors argued against papal legate Guala Beccetti. Louis's arguments in defense of his claim were not very strong, but they did not need to be, since the key issue was whether or not the risk was worth the reward. In the end, Philip declared that he would not support Louis, but would not forbid him to accept the offer. Actually, Philip may have simply been going through the motions, hoping to avoid papal displeasure by not officially supporting his son. Whatever his true feelings, Philip did not provide his son with any material support. Louis's own vassals would have to supply men or money, but the other leading men of the kingdom did not. The Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Champagne declined to help Louis, but he recruited enough counts and barons to raise 1,200 knights and 2 to 3 times as many soldiers. Although the great lords of Salisbury, Chester, Warren, Pembroke, and Cornwall remained loyal, John knew that they were not enough, so he sent agents to recruit mercenaries in Flanders, and convoys of mercenaries began crossing the Channel. Unfortunately, one convoy of ships foundered during a heavy storm, and hundreds of dead bodies washed up on the English coast for the next few months. Sadly, some of those bodies were children, since many of the mercenaries had brought their families with them, hoping for a better future. Large-scale recruitment of foreign soldiers for service would not remain secret, so the barons decided to occupy Rochester Castle, which dominated Watling Street, the Roman road that connected Dover and London, the A2 road today. A rebel-held Rochester Castle could block the mercenaries that John was hiring from the continent and shipping to Dover. Rochester officially belonged to Archbishop Langton, managed for him by the Sheriff of Kent. John had wanted to transfer the castle to the more loyal Peter de Roche, but Langton had resisted until he left England in mid-September to join every other major church official at the Fourth Lateran Council. Although Langton had taken the initiative to ensure that the first part of the Magna Carta confirmed the king's duty to the church, the Pope believed a letter from John that Langton had not supported the king sufficiently, and he was suspended from office on November 4th, 1215 by the man who had persisted so firmly to get Langton accepted as archbishop by John. Determined to make an example, John supervised the siege of Rochester Castle personally. Crossbowmen and catapult operators worked in shifts, while the blacksmiths labored day and night to supply the miners digging steadily under the castle. It was a grueling process, but in the end of November, John sent an order for 40 pigs, the fattest and least good for eating, to start a fire under the tower. The fat from those 40 pigs was spread on the wooden supports of the mine underneath the southeast tower and lit on fire, burning the supports and causing the tower to collapse. The surviving defenders retreated to an area inside the castle, but they finally surrendered on November 30th after almost 2 months. Since the leaders of the rebellion were in London, it would have made more sense to attack them when their morale was low, but John had always avoided direct conflict. Instead, he divided his army into two. Half of the army was sent to monitor the rebels in London, while he marched north. Since the rebellion had caused tax revenue to dry up, a northern expedition would be an ideal opportunity to loot enough funds to keep paying his foreign mercenaries, who made up the majority of his army. During the 60-plus years between the end of the anarchy in 1154 and the Barons' Revolt in 1215, England had known peace. Aside from the Great Revolt in 1173, most people in England were serfs, poor farmers who were not free to leave the lands of their lord. A small minority were free men able to live and work where they chose. While the peasants' lives were hard, they had been spared the sustained looting, raping, and burning that was common in medieval warfare, until John decided to discipline his barons. John left a trail of destruction behind him as he made his way north. News of his atrocities spread and convinced the commanders of castles to surrender and towns to pay huge ransoms. John did not stop at the border, invading Scotland in January, and then burned his way south through East Anglia. While his methods were brutal, they were effective. The Earl of Oxford, a major rebel leader, swore fealty to John on March 25th. In fact, the other mercenary army had crushed resistance in the south, and since rebels would smoothly receive their confiscated lands if they bent the knee, a flood of barons switched sides, leaving the holdouts in London isolated. It appeared that John's strategy had worked. He had broken many of the rebels, while the loot had paid the salaries of the mercenaries who kept him on the throne. John may have hoped that his huge army of mercenaries would have caused sufficient destruction to force enough barons to surrender, thus ending the rebellion before Louis arrived, but despite a remarkable expenditure of torches, he failed. Preferring to avoid the problem by preventing Louis from landing, John gathered ships to fight him in the Channel, but a storm destroyed most of his fleet on May 18th, so it appeared that John would have to fight the French at the beaches. However, when Louis's ships were sighted on May 21st, John refused to fight him at the beaches. It is possible that he feared that his mercenaries would not fight against fellow Frenchmen, but given the constant warfare in France during Henry and Richard's reigns, that seems unlikely. It is more believable that John did what he usually did when faced with an enemy with an actual army: choose the path of least immediate danger and retreat. Bad enough that he avoided battle, but he did not even tell his captains. He simply left with his guards, abandoning command of his army. John's cowardice caused him to lose more followers, while Louis made a triumphal entry into London on June 2nd. Once Louis linked up with the rebels, many barons who had sworn fealty to John to avoid destruction of their castles once again changed their minds. Louis led his army and the rebel barons to take a number of castles, which usually surrendered without a fight. Roughly a third of John's household knights abandoned him, as well as many earls and barons, including his half-brother, the Earl of Salisbury. By late June, 2/3 of English barons were rebels. As more and more barons switched sides again, John began to run out of money again. By the end of July, Louis controlled a third of England. As a king who had been invited to take the throne rather than gain the kingdom through conquest, Louis faced the challenge of creating an administration that integrated his English supporters and his French allies. With this goal in mind, he appointed Simon Langton, Stephen Langton's brother, his chancellor. Langton had been elected Archbishop of York, but had been opposed by John, who had persuaded Pope Innocent to nullify the appointment. Establishing a new government took time, but while in London, Louis learned that he had been excommunicated by Papal Legate Koala. As a genuine believer and a pragmatist who knew that success depended on the support of the church, this was a major blow, both personal and public. Still, it was probably not as overwhelming as it might appear. Both his father and his rival in England had been excommunicated and then welcomed back into the church with open arms once the issue had been resolved. Most of Louis's barons, English or French, did not care much anyway, and Louis was welcomed to London by 12 of the kingdom's 20 bishops. Only 5 churches in London actually followed the excommunication. but one of them was Westminster Abbey, which would delay Louis's coronation. Preoccupied with the campaign against John and aware that barons were joining his side every week, Louis was not overly concerned, so he decided to wait until both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Abbey would be available. Meanwhile, in Rome, Innocent was faced with a dilemma. Louis had disobeyed a papal legate and invaded England, which was a papal fief, but Louis was known to be a loyal son of the church who would inherit the powerful kingdom of France and likely gain the kingdom of England, so it would be unwise to make him an enemy. Rather than make a decision, Innocent played for time. However, Louis proved unable to balance the conflicting needs of his own French barons and the rebel English barons. Both wanted honors and, more importantly, land. There should have been enough to go around, but Louis gave most captured castles to the rebels. Realizing that the material rewards were less than advertised, some French barons decided to return home. Even with the aid of the rebel barons and another Scottish invasion, Louis only controlled parts of the kingdom. Most of the royal castles remained in royal hands. It is difficult to overstate the challenge of conquering England, a large kingdom greater in size than Normandy, Anjou, and Brittany combined. Those regions had required years of sustained warfare and widespread defections to fall to Philip, whose logistics center was a short march or trip by river away. Tired of chasing John, Louis returned to London in late July, where he learned that Innocent had died and had been succeeded by the more easygoing Honorius. At the same time, he was informed that the great city of Norwich had been captured, as had York in the north, while the King of Scotland was happily ravaging Northumbria. Still, Dover was necessary to secure his link to Flanders, so he began his siege of the imposing fortress on July 25th. Fortunately, Philip had sent over the Malvoisin, evil neighbor, probably the first trebuchet used in England. As ever, long, bloody sieges produced the same result, a steady trickle of departing lords and their men. While the siege was frustrating, Alexander of Scotland marched his army along 400 miles of England to swear fealty to Louis at Dover, and then returned without serious attack from the royalists, highlighting the weakness of John's rule. Still, many barons had concluded that they preferred the idea of Louis more than the reality. The Earls of Salisbury and York returned to John's camp, while two of the more hardline rebels, De Vesci and Geoffrey Manville, had died. Aware that men were deserting the French army, John became decisive and made a rapid march to try to catch King Alexander, who was in East Anglia, but then lost purpose when he missed the Scottish king. While Louis had established a solid foothold in England, the situation threatened to become a repeat of the anarchy, where neither side was strong enough to establish control of the kingdom. Fortunately, John suddenly, and admittedly unintentionally, did the best thing for England that he had ever done in his entire life. He died. John had spent most of September burning and looting his way through Norfolk and Suffolk. However, he fell ill, possibly with dysentery, in early October. By the time he reached Newark Castle on October 18th, he could not even sit on a horse, so he had to be carried in a litter. Realizing he was dying, he named his son Henry his heir, and appointed Guala, Marshal Ranulph of Chester, and Foc de Briot as the executors of his will. He then died on October 19, 1216. John's death transformed the situation, but what if he had not died? The situation was actually starting to resemble the anarchy, but the anarchy was essentially a civil war between two factions of the ruling family, similar to the later War of the Roses. If John had lived, the respective positions of England and France over the next couple of centuries would have been reversed. John's successors would frequently launch attempts to expand their foothold in France. If there was a weak French king and a strong English king, then English armies would rape and pillage their way across the French countryside as someone named Edward or Henry would fight someone named Philip, Louis, or Charles in an attempt to gain control of a few more towns. If John had lived, Louis would have likely failed to gain the throne, but he might have carved out some territory near the coast, perhaps won the loyalty of English barons by promising them lands in Normandy. England would not have had centuries of freedom from invasion and the ability to safely attack rivals with little fear of reprisal. But John died. I will explain what happened next in the next episode. Thanks for listening.